Okay, good morning and welcome to this event hosted by Fiscal Matters. We will be discussing fiscal policy and a new paradigm. Super excited for this event. It's going to be slightly more policy wonky, I suspect, than some of the events we've had so far. The idea today is to really get to the nuts and bolts of whether fiscal rules are fit for purpose. And the reason we are here today and the premise of the Fiscal Matters week of debate is very much that we feel that many decisions post-2008 and after the financial crisis, a lot of those fiscal policy decisions happened behind closed doors. And there was not enough of the debate about what could happen. And we feel as a coalition that there is at least three reasons why there should be an open debate and why we should start rethinking fiscal rules. The first one is environmental breakdown, and that we think it might lead to exponential and irreversible social and economic costs. And effectively, you can't really put a price tag on delay or inaction, the costs of which will exceed early and decisive interventions. And in any case, we would make the case that environmental breakdown presents fiscal risks to the public sector's balance sheet. So those people who are concerned about public debt levels, we know that they will be far higher if we don't act sooner. The second reason is a social just transition and recovery. Outside of the unprecedented scale of investment for the green transition and recovery, the type of recovery and the green transition Europe needs is really unlikely to be neither timely, democratic, or fair without unlocking public finance so it's aligned and not at odds with full employment, rewarding livelihoods and ecological sustainability. The third reason we think it's necessary to rethink fiscal framework is more of a macroeconomic one, and that is that monetary policy is currently hamstrung. And central banks can no longer be charged with doing all the countercyclical heavy lifting, which is why many central bankers now are calling on the government to bring fiscal policy back in from the cold. So these are some of the topics that we're going to hopefully try and address today. I am going to first hand you over to my colleague, Sarah Arnold, senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. She'll be our moderator today and will guide us through the events. I'd like to thank our co-hosts, Finance Watch, for helping me organize this event, as well as my colleague, Dominic Caddick at the New Economics Foundation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, everyone. I'm your moderator today. And as Frank said, my name is Sarah. And for me, this is such an important time to be reflecting on our fiscal rules because climate scientists tell us this is the decisive decade of climate change. And COVID has exacerbated deep-seated social inequalities and poverty. And we need a fiscal framework that's fit to deal with these challenges. So I'm really excited to hear from our speakers and panelists today. And I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be a great session. So the agenda today is we're going to kick off with a short video from Fiscal Donoghue, President of the Eurogroup and Finance Minister for Ireland. He unfortunately couldn't make it today, but he's kindly sent a short video for us. That will be followed by a keynote speech from Giles Moore, who is head of the fiscal policy and surveillance in the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs of the European Commission. We'll then move on to a panel session, and I'll introduce the panelists at that time. They'll begin with some introductory remarks, and then we'll have a bit of an open discussion before taking questions from the audience. So please do drop your questions in the chat box, and we'll ask them over the course of the debate. And then we'll close. So first, let's hear from Fiscal Donoghue, which Dom's going to play a video.
Good morning, and thank you to the organising committee, to the New Economics Foundation and Finance Watch for the invitation to speak today. It is a privilege and an important part of my job as President of the Eurogroup to participate in these events, and I hope that your deliberations go well. Ideally, I would, of course, have liked to have participated in a live way, but these few weeks are really busy as a result of both domestic and European work. This includes preparations for the upcoming Irish budget and, of course, next week's Eurogroup meeting. For today, I will speak in my role as President of the Eurogroup. I've been in this role now for just over a year, and I'll try to give you a sense of where we are in terms of the Euro area's budgetary strategy. I'm also really conscious that the fiscal framework is topical given the Commission's recent announcement that it will shortly relaunch its review. I will again aim to touch on this from a Eurogroup perspective. So, turning to the budgetary strategy across the Euro area. Since the pandemic hit in early 2020, I believe that budgetary policy within the Euro area has been very supportive and it has been agile. There are three broad facets to this case. First, once the impact of COVID-19 became apparent, Member States allowed their tax and social protection systems to act in full and without delay. These are the so-called automatic stabilisers that are such an integral part of fiscal policy at a national level and then within the European Union. However, these were supplemented by a range of new discretionary support measures, such as additional health spending and wage subsidy schemes, that further protected homes and businesses. All of this was facilitated by the early decision in March of 2020 to suspend the fiscal rules and to ease state aid requirements. These actions sent a clear and early signal that the response to COVID-19 would be very different to previous crises. As a result, we have seen high levels of borrowing right across the Euro area since the end of 2019. Last year, the budget deficit in the Euro area amounted to 7.2% of national income, and a similar figure is likely for this year. These are unprecedented levels of borrowing, but they reflect the strength of these so-called automatic stabilisers, the impact of additional health spending, and also the impact of new discretionary support schemes. These actions were also complemented by a series of guarantees and liquidity supports for businesses. All of these supports cushioned our economies from the worst effect of the pandemic. They also left us in a good place to recover once vaccinations gathered momentum and as restrictions were eased. We have seen the success of this strategy over the summer months, and the budgetary policy within the Euro area has been integral to the economic rebound currently underway. Second, aside from member state responses, a series of safety nets to the value of €540 billion were agreed at Eurogroup. These included the SURE programme, the ESM's pandemic crisis support, and the EIB's Pan-European Guarantee Fund. All of these schemes are operational, and the success of the SURE programme in particular, with about 31 million jobs participating in the scheme, does, I believe, speak volumes. In addition, the agreement on Next Generation EU was a groundbreaking achievement. While I won't go into it in too much depth, as you'll all know, it will funnel several hundreds of billions of euros into transforming our economies through a mixture of grants and loans at exactly the point additional economic support will be needed. Thirdly, it's also worth stressing the role that monetary policy has played through the pandemic. The ECB was swift and decisive in its decision-making through non-standard measures such as the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme. These actions created a supportive monetary policy environment that resulted in lower yields and facilitated the flow of liquidity at these difficult times. And as we look to 2022, the Europe Group reached agreement with unanimity earlier on the need for a supportive budgetary approach. Our messaging on this has been clear and consistent. In simple terms, there will be no premature withdrawal of budgetary support. We remain focused on the need to turn the current economic rebound into a balanced recovery. Increasingly targeted supports can help in this regard. And in this regard, draft budgetary plans for 2022 are now being drawn up. These will be discussed at Eurogroup in the coming weeks, and we'll issue a statement on budgetary strategy towards the end of 2021. So now turning to the governance review and to the fiscal rules. This is something that, of course, we'll be closely involved with, and I anticipate wide-ranging discussions on these topics in the coming months. Eurogroup will play an important role in this process from both a euro area perspective, given the euro area specific elements of the framework, but also more broadly, given the importance of the rules themselves. There are clearly a wide range of views and opinions on the rules and on the overall framework. This is, of course, a challenging subject, and I know that compromise will be important. At Eurogroup, we will be discussing the framework, and we will issue, as I said a moment ago, a statement on budgetary policy later in the year. What I can say is that we're entering this debate from a position of strength, given the level of coordination and consensus to date on budgetary policy. Over the past few weeks, we've already seen arguments being put forward in relation to the governance review. It is clear that some changes may be needed and that the framework needs to reflect the realities within which we operate. But our starting point for this debate is robust. Our shared experiences in dealing with the pandemic have shown our ability to deliver both compromises and solutions. So I've covered a fair bit of ground this morning, and I hope the rest of your discussions go well. I would suggest two takeaways from my contribution. First, that the euro area's budgetary strategy has worked really well. We have seen this already during the summer months as our economies have reopened. Growth prospects have improved, and I believe they will continue to improve. That said, we need to remain vigilant, and our supports will have to become more and more targeted in the context of overall budgetary strategy continuing to remain supportive next year. Secondly, that our fiscal framework, despite its imperfections, has worked well to date. The early move to activate the General Escape Clause was a key decision. It highlighted the flexibility inside the current system. Of course, improvements can always be made, and the Commission's governance review will be very important. Within Eurogroup, we look forward to engaging in this process in the months ahead. So thank you again for the invitation, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day and the week ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Dom, for playing that video, and I hope everyone was able to hear it okay. I think that was a really helpful introduction, setting out the context of recent fiscal policy decisions from the point of view of the Eurogroup and some insight into future budgetary policy. And we're now going to turn to a keynote speech from Giles Moore, Head of the Unit of Fiscal Policy and Surveillance and the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs of the European Commission. If you're all set up, Giles. I think you're on mute still, but we can see your presentation. Dom, can you unmute Giles?
Mute. Can you hear me? I I have unfortunately a host of technical problem, so apologies for that. I mean, I try now to put the camera, if I manage. Okay, I hope you can see me. Now I will try the heroic feat of uploading my presentation. And
we can already see it.
You can?
Yes, we can see you and we can see the presentation on your screen.
It's on slide 17.
Okay, very good. Can you now see my main slide? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Apologies for all the glitch. I never faced such a technical nightmare, but many thanks for the colleague helping me out in real time. So without to say that it's a pleasure to have been invited to this event. It's also an honor to be speaking after Pascal Donahue. So I will have a very difficult task, and in 10-15 minutes. So I will basically present a bit what we know about the review of the economic surveillance framework, which has not resumed yet, but is likely to resume, is set to resume very shortly. Then I will go to one aspect illustrated by our past review and fiscal surveillance, namely the need to foster economic stabilization, which has been highlighted, a challenge which has been highlighted further by the crisis. I will also look at the key role of the fiscal framework in promoting the quality of public finance. And lastly, the key issue of debt sustainability will be addressed. So let me, I am in slide 3, so I hope you can see the slide. Thank you. So the legislation required the Commission to conduct a regular review every 5 years. The Commission actually published its most recent review in February 2020 and launched a public debate just after that on the next step, based of the outbreak of the pandemic in Europe. And the public consultation was put on hold to concentrate on the emergency response. The Commission, in its communication of 2021, mentioned that the recovery, when the recovery takes hold, the Commission intends to relaunch the public debate, and is precisely what we will do. I mean, in her speech on the State of the Union on 15th September, the President of the Commission stressed 3 things. First of all, the need to reflect on how the crisis has affected the shape of our economy. To do that, the Commission will relaunch the discussion on the economic governance review in the coming weeks. So this means 2 things. This means that the review of and the consultation around the EU fiscal rule will be taken within the broader context of the economic governance review, including also the MIP. And it will take place very shortly. And the last point, highlight the fact that it's key to build a consensus on the way forward. So what the President said in a speech, not talking about a precise legal vehicle, but took a step back and mentioned the key role of building and rebuilding a consensus well in time for 2023, where the Commission will likely lift the general escape clause and come back to more regular surveillance. So, I mean, I'm not a wizard. and I think I can only share with you some personal thought on what could be the relevant, in an non-exhaustive manner, what could be the relevant element for a review. I mean, we should start from the main conclusion from the 2020 review, which is still relevant. And actually, their challenges highlighted are even more pressing than before the pandemic. We need also, and the president was adamant on that, draw the lesson from the COVID-19 crisis. And I think we need to draw some conclusion in the context of a longer trend of green transition, population aging, and digital transformation. But we should not overlook the current economic context, which is actually the role of fiscal policy in times of very low interest rate. And I suppose that this element has also driven the choice of the title you have toward a new paradigm. So what is clear is we need to support the recovery, and when conditions allow, achieve prudent fiscal position. The RRF implementation, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility implementation, would be a key in this respect. So let me jump to basically what we learned from the crisis, and I start from the stabilization angle. There has been, as Pascal Donahue have said eloquently, a drop in GDP, which has been unprecedented and higher than in the global financial crisis. And on the other end, there has been a policy response in terms, for instance, of the headline deficit. So in the right-hand side a chart, when you can see that the headline deficit has passed from close to 0 or half a point of GDP to 7% of GDP deficit. And this metrics is interesting because it also includes not only the discretionary policy response, which has been forceful, but also the automatic stabilizer. So there has been a massive response by the member states. And this has been made possible by the relaxation of or the adaptation of the regulatory framework. I mean, we talk about the state aid, the relaxation of the framework of the structural fund, but of course, there has been the general escape clause regarding the Stability and Growth Pact. But the response has not been only regulatory. As Pascal Donahue mentioned, he stressed it, there has been the creation, a real-time creation of backstop, new instrument, such as the temporary support to mitigate unemployment risk in an emergency. And this was SURE. SURE provided cheap loan to member states to help them implement retention, job retention policy, so short-term work scheme and equivalent, to preserve employment. And it seems that, as Pascal Donahue have said very eloquently, this speaks volume. I mean, the instrument has supported 31 million people, of which close to 9 million self-employed. National labor market measures supported by SURE are likely to have reduced unemployment by almost 1.5 million in 2020. And we did that by calculating the gap to the Hawking law, so basically the regular pattern of unemployment to GDP shock. And so this is in the very recent report published actually the 22nd of this month, and you will find the report a lot of technical, further technical element. And so first, SURE. Second, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And here, of course, you can see that the amount at play is close to 700 billion, is a clear scale-up. What the Recovery and Resilience Facility does in a nutshell is provide grants a combination of grants and loan to actually help member state finance public investment and help them carry out structural reform to mitigate the economic, social impact on the pandemic, but also to prepare the future in the triple context of the digital transformation, the green transition, and the population aging. And actually this, while SURE has been very popular and was requested by 19 member states, I think the Recovery and Resilience Facility is meant to cover all member states. An important element, and I will be very quick, is that the policy mix compared to the past crisis has been mutually reinforcing. So there has been a coordination de facto of the monetary policy and fiscal policy. So as you can see in the graph, they have worked well together. And so basically what we learn at this stage is two lessons. We learned from when I was studying economics, we learned that discretionary policy was old-fashioned. It was not efficient and not timely. I think the massive response to the pandemic have proven this paradigm wrong. Two, the response is more forceful when the two arms of the policy mix work together. But this is, but let me now instill the discussion of the fiscal rule by quoting actually one of analysis of our report in the public finance. The DG ECFIN produce regularly an analytical report trying to shed some new policy relevant analytical evidence. And there is a very interesting one. We show that actually you have this belief that fiscal policy is procyclical. But is it procyclical because of the rule, as some claim, or despite of the rules? And it seems that our analysis show that compliance with fiscal rule actually help reducing procyclicality. So in the preventive arm, when you meet the target, your procyclicality is mitigated. When your debt is low, procyclicality is mitigated. On the other end, when debt is high, procyclicality is exacerbated, is amplified. And this is the case, for instance, if a country is in EDP, is in a, for instance, or an assistance program. Another takeaway is that spending rule is less procyclical than structural balance rule because they are not dependent on the annual swing of the potential output, which is meant to be non-cyclical, but in practice, it captures a cyclical pattern, is robust to also the cyclical tax windfall, tax shortfall, and it excludes also the interest payment. So it's really, we think, a more or less pro-cyclical instrument. And of course, it's easier to basically communicate and dovetail nicer with the national fiscal process. We reason in terms of spending volume and spending increase. So my conclusion on this first element is that the pandemic has highlighted the positive role of counter-cyclical discretionary fiscal policy and the very crucial importance of European coordination between member states and the EU, between the two basically arms of the policy mix. So how can national fiscal policy respond to economic fluctuation while complying to the EU fiscal rule and restoring necessary buffer? This will be a question that the review and the public consultation will have to address. But an important element will be to use the tool introduced during the crisis, and in particular the RRF, to support the recovery and the long-term growth. Let's realize that IRF is actually money from the sky. So you could actually have an adjustment of the public finance while having a positive fiscal stance coming from the support of the RRF. And it will be also important to not to lose sight of the big picture and to monitor and address macroeconomic imbalances. And we know that they have an important impact on fiscal outcome. So Promoting now the second challenge is promoting the quality of public finance. And basically the question is how to measure up to the very large public investment need. And I will show that actually we enter the crisis with very historically low level of investment, which can barely actually renew the capital stock. So it was just compensating the depreciation. What the RF has done is basically concentrate its effort on public investment, private investment, which is the lion's share of the RF spending. And this is very important. And over, for instance, current spending concern also education and growth-friendly spending. But this, I think RF has been a game changer in the sense that the recovery, according to the forecast, will be like never before, much more investment intensive that it used to be in the past, where during the great financial crisis, actually investment dropped, while here investment will increase. But let's make no mistake. I mean, what could be the we need to basically see how the fiscal framework will help incentivize investment. But we have also to keep in mind the fact that it's not the fiscal rule which are harnessing investment. It's actually high public debt and unsustainable public finance, which actually exercise a constraint. And we have some analysis where we show that indeed the impact on debt, on the quality, on investment has been negative. And this has been confirmed by an excellent paper by Baciotti, Borghi, and Misale, based on the previous crisis and based on long historical data. However, the good news is well-designed institution, as measured by the strength of fiscal rule or the quality of institution by the World Bank, appear to reduce the negative impact. So this is also the red curve, which when you move up to the x-axis, you increase the design of national fiscal rule as we measure it in the Commission, and we actually, and this reduce the negative effect. So in a way, a well-working fiscal rule mean debt sustainability, mean macroeconomic stabilization, and mean an important framework condition for investment. So the conclusion will be that the effective implementation of Next Generation EU and the RRF should actually deliver an increase in additional potential by 2024, which will be structural, concern long-term growth, and may create 2 million jobs. The question is, how, I mean, of any review and of any consultation would be how fiscal policy would support the green and digital transition, how to incentivize adequate public investment, and does green investment deserve a special treatment? After all, I mean, green investment have concrete benefit for the country implementing it, but it's also the supply of a global public good, namely the reduction of the greenhouse gas emission. So I will finish up by a key aspect. So last but not least, ensuring sustainability. And here the question comes to mind is the traditional Maastricht paradigm really outdated? So this paradigm is telling you a fiscal policy should cap debt in a monetary union. The monetary policy should take care of the common shocks, of the big shocks, and the discretionary policy at a national level should care about sustainability, while the automatic stabilizer address actually the stabilization purpose. So, but recently this paradigm has been called into question by some prominent economists, saying we shouldn't care about high public debt in basically the current context of negative R management, of favorable growth versus interest differential. But I think that the reality seems a little bit more nuanced. I mean, look at the left-hand side. The public debt skyrocket in the crisis. It increased a lot compared to the pre-Great Financial Crisis in 2008, and continue to increase and will be on a slow receding path. Look at the right-hand side. I mean, more countries now find themselves in a low, in the medium sustainability risk versus low sustainability risk before the pandemic. And this take into account also, the contingent liability, I mean, the implicit liability due to hedging. So should we still worry about a high public debt? And we are of the view that the response is a forceful yes. Higher debt is certainly less costly when the interest growth differential is negative, and this will help actually finance investment. So this is a very good news, but very strong reason to keep debt under control. I mean, negative interest growth differential, it is lasting forever. I mean, I think what we learned from the crisis is that there is a lot of unknown. There is a lot of things we don't know. And the level of economies, a level of uncertainty, and sometimes challenge what the best economists knew before the crisis. We have to also be mindful that even if the marginal interest rate is not changing, market perception of sustainability risk for particular country may also change, increasing risk premium. But also, we have to see that R minus G, or the interest growth differential, is not the whole story. I mean, public debt is also due to increase from its other component, which is the deficit, the primary deficit. And because of population aging, which is a massive challenge, but also maybe to the buildup of high contingent liability. So essentially guarantee provided by the government. They are representing, I mean, this contingent liability, 20% of GDP. And only a fraction has been called. There could be more, a bigger fraction could be called in the future. So it will be wise to have buffer, not only from a stabilization point of view to have fiscal space to accommodate future crises, but also to have fiscal space for the more structural challenge represented by the green, digital, and I would say gray transformation. And we have to be clear. If debt is used to finance the increase of productive investment, we may increase intergenerational equity. But this requires that debt is also used to build up, increase public capital. And what I show in my earlier slide is in the crisis, when we enter the crisis, the level of public investment was just covering the depreciation of the capital stock. So I have my two last slide. So if you could bear with me 1 minute. This is a contrafactual debt scenario we have built. The baseline is actually the actual trajectory of debt. So it's the thick dark line. And the red and the green represent actually compliance with fiscal rule. And if you comply with fiscal rule, you built up quite some fiscal space. And the build-up is even stronger if you take EB, expenditure benchmark, so spending rule, compared to SB, which is the structural balance. But the primary, let's say, the primary result is that complying with your fiscal rule help actually build fiscal space. So, and this take into account, of course, second round effect from GDP. So how to reduce a high public debt ratio in a sustainable growth-friendly manner? I think in the debate now, you have a blossom of paper, blossoming vein of paper talking of the need to move away from numerical, sorry for the typo, numerical fiscal rule toward more principle. very interesting reflection, and we need to take that into account. I think an issue popped to mind is clearly the implementability. If we have difficulty to implement numerical fiscal rule, what will be the situation with principle? An important element will be also the role of debt sustainability analysis, and which display a much richer picture than just debt, which is static and don't take into account future dynamic. But one issue which has concentrated criticism is the debt reduction benchmark in its current form, which has been seen as too stringent and too pro-cyclical, and at the end, not really apply, so not really operational to address debt. Another issue, I mean, will be of more, let's say, governance nature, will pertain to how we organize the governance, and it will be the role of national fiscal framework, national independent fiscal institution. I think the broader issue is how basically to balance EU scrutiny with national implementation, knowing that I think it's challenging from any assessor to influence the behavior of sovereign. And this we have to, this is difficult in a world where fiscal policy is decentralized and member states have, of course, have the fiscal sovereignty. So I would like to thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that I didn't dash off too much. And apologies for the glitch. It was a good. I had my fair share of adrenaline before starting, but many thanks for attention.
Thanks, Giles, so much for that. That was really great. A lot to digest there. And I believe we will share the slides after the event for anyone who wants to catch up on anything. What really stood out for me is you made a really clear case for the strong role of some form of fiscal rules can play in helping deliver against your three challenges of promoting economic stability, promoting the quality of public finance and ensuring debt sustainability, but also really highlighting that the design of these rules matter and that some of the issues that need to be covered in designing fiscal frameworks. So I believe, Giles, you'll be sticking around for the panel. So please do put any questions for him in the chat. I see there's been a couple of questions so far from Raymond. Other people do put your questions in, please. But now I'd like to introduce our fantastic panelists. We have three panelists today. Unfortunately, Gregory Claes, a senior economist at Bruegel, was unable to join us today due to personal circumstances. But our three panelists today are Orsola Constantini, who's an economic affairs officer at UNCTAD, and is also associate editor of the International Journal of Political Economy, and was previously senior economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. We've also got Professor Özlem Onran, who's a professor of economics at the University of Greenwich and is director of Greenwich Political Economy Research Centre. And finally, we've got Christian Odendahl, chief economist at the Centre for European Reform, working on European monetary and fiscal policy, European integration and economic growth. So we'll start with some opening remarks from our panelists. Panelists, if you could please keep it to around 5 to 7 minutes if possible. Could we start with Orsola Constantini? Over to you.
Thank you. Let me share a short PowerPoint. Okay, can you see it? Okay, so thank you very much for invitation, and thank you, Gilles, for your keynote, very, very interesting. I wanted to start by some historical comments. As you probably know, synthetic fiscal indicators began being used in the 60s as guidelines for fiscal policy. And back then, if you read the papers, even by the economists that actually produced the full employment surplus in the Kennedy era, were quite unhappy with the sort of the feeling of being cornered into having to produce index numbers that have inevitably problems, as Blinder and Solo in this quotation say, trying to reduce a multidimensional concept into a single dimension. But they realized, as they often say in these papers, that the public seems to need a number, traditionally a budget deficit, to view with pride or alarm, as the case may be. In reality, if that might be the case, might have been the case back then in a society that was very faithful, had a lot of faith on technical progress and on technicians, I am very much doubtful that this is the case today. In fact, one main characteristic, we would say, of the European society post-2008 is widespread disbelief in experts, which, when it comes to economics, eventually translated into a very healthy, I think, skepticism toward certain principles and instruments. This, I can say that, as economists, give us a privilege and also a duty, in a way, to really say quite openly when there are we are sort of pushed or forced to use index numbers that are not accurate or have multiple limitations. And this, I think, is the case with the Stability and Growth Pact and its indicators, much more than it was with the full employment surplus in the 60s for a few reasons. In fact, first of all, it's a much more binding instrument that's based on an estimate. Fiscal indicators usually incorporate a fiscal target. So, for instance, in the full employment surplus, it was full employment. The policy target never ceased to be full employment. So that was also the measure by which politicians had to, establish their success or failure. In the EU, instead, it's the budget measure that is the target, and every other goal is integrated by means of a specific economic theory into that budget estimate. And that means, on the one hand, that you have one economic theory that by law is defined as the correct one, and on the other hand, you have that this same theory is what filters the measure of success or failure of a policy. With sort of naked emperor effects, like with the Nauru, when, thanks to which, whether we realize it or not, whether we have a job or not, we know that we are in full employment by decree, as Alain Pargues once quite eloquently wrote. So the problem is essentially that potential output in this estimate is supply determined exclusively. So there is no role for demand side effects on growth. And this implies that a reduction in the rate of growth cannot, by design, be recognized as a policy failure, due, for example, to austerity. And so in practice, for the potential output is calculated as a sophisticated average, and itself it moves with the cycle, absorbs its fluctuations in actual output, and which are then attributed to supply side factors. And this creates a vicious circle between austerity and policy space and a justification for bad policies. It seems to me that we need to return to targets that are observed and measurable and far less theory laden. And in fact, they need to be directly linked to markers of the society's well-being. After what has been a disappointing decade for economic growth and a devastating and deadly pandemic that lasted 2 years, that hasn't ended yet, I believe that we need to reconsider the fiscal framework, and the proposal to reinstate the Stability and Growth Pact as we have heard from in both the speeches early on, the proposal to reinstate the pact is based on the idea that it can be flexible enough, and it can be anyway suspended whenever there is an emergency. So in this slide, I have some of the concepts that I would like to discuss in the next hour with you about how a new fiscal framework should look like, in my view. But I want to focus on this sentence that is in bold here: fiscal policy beyond shocks absorption for shock prevention. And the problem with what I just said, the fact that the Stability and Growth Pact is believed to be flexible enough, is that this idea is based on the concept that fiscal policy can only help when there's a shock by absorbing the consequences of that shock. So, for instance, with transfers, unemployment insurance, and so on. And there is no role for shock prevention. I think the new fiscal framework should focus on that. I think we've seen quite plainly in this pandemic how decades of austerity have depleted public resources, which were, for instance, in the healthcare sector, which couldn't possibly be reinstated in an emergency situation very quickly. Moreover, when you cut your budgets for a long time, that affects the wealth of the private wealth, and also the resilience of the society to crisis, especially the resilience of those who are more reliant on public services. And moreover, if the size of the public sector shrinks, for instance, because of privatizations, that means that a larger part of the economy depends on private expectations, and as a result, income fluctuations are larger, both in booms and in busts. So I believe that this is the direction the new fiscal framework should go to, and I look forward to discuss the other points later.
Thanks, Ursula. If you have any particular questions, please put them in the chat. I think for me, what really stood out from your presentation was you really highlighted the logical flaws in the current fiscal framework. So thanks for that. So next up, we've got Professor Özlem Onran.
Thank you so much for having me. Shall I also share my screen? That I think makes it easier to follow in the Zoom context. Yes, I suppose you can see my presentation. When I was asked to talk about a new paradigm, I thought I should start with this idea of a needs-based fiscal policy. What should be the long-term role for public investment to address the social, economic, ecological needs of our time. And obviously, COVID-19 pandemic, as unlucky as it is giving us some space to rethink the role of fiscal policy, as we have heard so eloquently in Giles's presentation today. It is certainly opening the space to think about public investment in key sectors of social and physical infrastructure. And I'm very happy that there is now more coordination and pooling of public spending needs at the EU level around RRP. But I'm also still worried that these policies are all falling short of linking the short-term emergency shock absorption response to long-term rebuilding, very much in line with the ideas Ursula has presented before me. And of course, COVID-19 crisis is adding to the existing long-standing fiscal needs that our societies have in terms of addressing the care deficit and ecological deficit that were there before the pandemic. And to that, we should add the inequalities ranging from class to race, gender, and very deep regional inequalities in the EU context. All of these have been exacerbated by the crisis. They've deepened after the pandemic. So the budget needs to address these needs. However, we see that the budget deficit is still conventionally seen as a binding constraint. Hence, we need a paradigm shift in fiscal policy. So what is this needs-based approach I'm talking about? It is an approach to address the long-term ecological and care deficits while tackling inequalities by mobilizing sufficient public infrastructure investment in both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. With social infrastructure, I am referring to what is in our national accounts conventionally seen as current spending in education, healthcare, social care, childcare. So there is a need to redefine what investment is, and certainly this care infrastructure is infrastructure in the future long-term productivity, if you like, from the supply side perspective. It does influence potential output, but it's also investment in our social fabric. For me, within this needs-based new paradigm of fiscal policy, it's also important to avoid a false dichotomy between competing needs and trying to think of what is the urgent priority of our day. That doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the sustainability of public debt to GDP ratio. Of course we should. We should just think, how can we fund these needs? So let's start with the spending needs, the regional disparities, other inequalities that we want to tackle, make a long-term plan about annual spending, and then let's see how we fund it. And one positive aspect of the European response to the COVID-19 crisis was to see that, well, there is money. Now, if I just start with a very basic macroeconomic reminder to all of us, part of public spending will always be self-financing because of the multiplier effects of public spending on economic output, even without changing any tax rate or other measures. So there is money, but there is not unlimited money. Obviously, public spending won't finance 100% of itself. Well, for the rest, then we will use all tools in our kit, which is borrowing, as we have seen in the EU context, that has been possible. We need to use the European Investment Bank, ideally working in tandem with regional, national investment banks or development banks. And of course, we need to mobilize taxation in a progressive fashion of not just income, but also wealth. And I think this needs to be designed at the European level in terms of also a progressive contribution to the EU budget, not just progressive taxation at the nation state level for national fiscal policy. Now, I said progressive taxation shouldn't be limited to income, but also cover wealth. And if we start with the needs in terms of addressing ecological care deficits and inequalities, the amount of spending needs is substantial. Wealth tax is a tool that we haven't sufficiently tapped into in the past 3 decades. There were higher wealth tax rates in the 70s, so it is possible to ease the budget constraints on fiscal spending and sometimes earmark some of these spending. For example, inheritance tax can be earmarked to fund long-term social care needs. And we have to keep in mind that inequality in wealth distribution and the concentration of wealth at the top 1% increased substantially after the pandemic. So it is waiting to be addressed by taxation policies. Now, the European Union, I think, is an excellent opportunity because it's giving us the chance to better coordinate fiscal policy across the countries if we could coordinate it in the right way, coordinating an expansionary fiscal policy stance, of course, the effects are much stronger once those policies are implemented simultaneously in all the countries. That topped up with an EU-level intervention, at EU-level substantial budget as well. And I should also add that fiscal policy effects become supporter if those policies are coordinated with labor market policies that will facilitate an increase in the incomes of the households, an increase in wages, again, a policy to address inequalities as well, but also creates more fiscal space because it does facilitate tax revenues even without a change in tax rates. I'll just stop by saying we have done some macroeconometric simulations of what such a mixed policy would look like. We did it for the EU context a while ago, coordinating 15 EU member states of Western Europe, where we saw those strong effects. Then recently we have expanded the macroeconometric model and implemented it for the UK, sadly a country which is not anymore a member state. But this just gives you the flavor of what such a needs-based policy would look like. So an investment in social, purple, and physical green infrastructure every year increasing by 1 percentage point of GDP. In the context of social infrastructure investment, I am referring to what you would conventionally see in the national accounts as current spending, meaning hiring more nurses, care workers, teachers, and increasing their hourly pay rate as well, while closing the gender pay gap. Or the green investment would be renewable energy, public transport, social housing with zero energy, net zero energy use, and so on. On the taxation side, it is increasing the tax rate by 1 percentage point on average taxes on wealth collected as a ratio to wealth. In the UK context, that's going back to late 1970s, meaning doubling the current tax rate on wealth, which is just below 1 percentage point. And the progressivity is coming from increasing the tax rate on profit income while decreasing the tax rate on labor income, each by 1 percentage point. On the labor market policy side, public sector is leading the way by increasing wages in an upward convergence fashion, closing gender pay gaps, and with appropriate labor market policies, regulations, and collective voice for trade unions, that could hopefully be achieved in the private sector as well, and increase in real wage rates while closing gender gaps. The effect of that on output is extremely positive. In the medium run, when you build in also the productivity gains that comes from public investment, but also the buoyant private investment in this expansionary context, output increases by 10%. Employment of both men and women increase quite substantially again. Employment of women is stimulated more than men because of the emphasis on social infrastructure spending, and public finance, public debt to GDP ratio improves by a massive 10 percentage point in the medium run, but also in the short run. I want to conclude by saying taxation of wealth was one of the most effective policy tools in terms of stimulating private investment, thereby output and productivity among all of these individual tools of what I call a purple, green, red New Deal. So it is possible to invest in a caring and sustainable society in a new fiscal paradigm, starting with the needs of the societies, economies of the European Union, and taxing wealth seems a key crucial policy tool, obviously among other tools to fund that. I'm gonna end by rephrasing Keynes for the 21st century. An equitable and sustainable development would need public investment in both green and purple infrastructure, along with a pay rise for both men and women, And shorter hours, I haven't talked about that labor market policy dimension today. It's something I'm working on currently. So Keynes had famously said, take care of full employment and the budget will take care of itself. For the 21st century, we're saying take care of full employment and decent pay for both women and men, equality and sustainability. And then the budget indeed takes care of itself. Thank you very much and look forward to comments and questions.
Thanks very much for that, Özlem. I think you gave a really clear vision there of how a needs-based fiscal framework could actually work in practice, and really highlighting the full range of fiscal tools that could help with that. So now to hear from our last speaker, Christian Odendahl, and then we'll turn to questions. So please do keep putting your questions in the chat.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I suspected that speaking after Pascal and Giles and Osla and Özlem, there would not be that much left to say. But as sort of the German on this call, I thought I'd take the opportunity to look a little bit into sort of where I see a political opening, depending on which argument you want to make for reforming the fiscal rules, and where I see the problems. So the first argument that is often made in terms of reforming the fiscal rules is that the assessment of the past decade in particular shows that there's a clear need for reform. I personally think this is economically a convincing point. We know that the countercyclical features of our fiscal framework, or let's just say of our fiscal policy, taking Giles' point on board that this is not all down to the fiscal rules, of our fiscal policy has not worked so well as we would have liked. We know that for a long time, monetary policy needed support from the fiscal side and was not receiving it. We know that debt reduction, that we thought was a very important issue in the short term, was not as urgent as we thought at the time, considering how low interest rates are now. We know now that investment took a bad hit, as Giles was showing in his chart, at a time when the opposite should have happened, clearly. I agree that this is not all fault of the fiscal rules, but I do think we need to think about what a sort of, let's put it more generally, what a governing framework we can find for fiscal policy to make it better. And one of the things that I found striking in this debate is there was, for a long time ago now, a proposal by 7 German and 7 French economists on replacing it with an expenditure rule. And it seemed their aim was to make fiscal rules less pro-cyclical. I thought this language was interesting in a way that that our goals should not be to make them less pro-cyclical, but to make them counter-cyclical. So it's a sort of, what is our ambition? What is that we want to achieve? And this is all sort of before taking the points that Özlem and Osla made into account, which I think are too absent from our a bit narrow macro fiscal rules debate that we've been having for 10 years, I think. So I think the case here is relatively strong. We can talk more in detail about this in the Q&A, but I don't think the politics of this is very strong, because we do need to convince sort of the veto players in this game, and they sit in some of the more northern countries and some of the more conservative parties. And you can see from my gray hair, I'm old enough to have had this debate for a decade now. And I can tell you that this argument does not get very far. I'm not saying we shouldn't try. We should always push these arguments and make the case for a different fiscal policy framework. But I think sort of for the shorter term, the political opening there is not very large. The second argument is sort of the COVID pandemic. So Pascal is right that in severe crisis, the rules have worked because we suspended them. Right. I mean, I'm paraphrasing him here, but I think there's merit to the argument that we need sort of a fiscal framework for the good times to be able to spend in bad times. Right. This argument is in German context often overdone, but we shouldn't completely downplay it. There's some merit to this. And this pandemic has increased debt levels considerably, as Giles has shown. The economic damage is yet unclear, I think. So that means that the debt reduction targets that we have in the rules are even tougher to reach than before. And I think even before this pandemic, we knew that they were a bit too tough for the shorter term. But I think here the politics again is a bit tricky, because in the eyes of those who want to stick with the current setup, the increase in public debt and the COVID pandemic, and sort of the flexibility of the rules in this pandemic by suspending them, in the eyes of people, has shown that this system not only works, but is even more needed than before, because we need to make room for the next crisis, and that means that the debt reduction target shouldn't be touched. I also want to point out that the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or let's call it the Next Generation EU, that this has cost sort of political capital in those parts of Europe that are opposed to these kinds of reforms and transfers. So if you want to make the argument that, you know, the COVID pandemic means that we need to give countries more time to reduce debts, for example, you have to take into account that those who were convinced of who were being convinced of the recovery fund thought they were helping through the recovery fund with this, and you know, so that the rules should rather stay the same. So to me, it's clear that we need a solution, because the debt reduction targets are too restrictive, and that the Next Generation EU was a way of trying to preserve investment, and Giles has shown that this is exactly what has happened. So I think we need to make a strong push here, but I just want to warn that there are some political battles to be had. Now, I don't want to, I mean, I'm a typical cheery German optimist, so I don't want to sort of give you the impression that I don't see any opening for proper reform. So here goes number one. This is the changing geopolitical setup. So during the Euro crisis, those older will remember, geopolitics rarely, if ever, played a role in this. It did play a role in terms of we want to preserve the euro as a European project and make sure that the EU survives this. But the broader geopolitical situation has never really played a role in that debate. But now, one of the main policy issues is, as sovereign Europe, is sort of the changing geopolitical situation with the US and China and autocracies in Europe's neighborhoods. And I think one of the main reasons why Angela Merkel not only agreed to Next Generation EU, but actively pushed for it and put a lot of her own political capital into this, is because the economic strength of Europe and being politically united is more important now than maybe it was in the time of the Eurozone crisis. So the argument of we need to strengthen Europe, the digital transition, for example, I think is a very strong argument in favor of more common European investment and even funded by common European debt, because this is about Europe's strength. And I think this is an argument that we should develop a bit more. And the big one, of course, is climate change. I don't remember any Eurozone discussion in sort of the height of the Euro crisis that featured the word climate change, even though it should have been clear at the time that we need to prepare our countries for the transition that is inevitably going to happen in record speed in the 2020s and 2030s. And so I think this is the biggest political opening we have. And this is also where I see sort of the German, now I'm talking about the German election again, sorry, I've been talking about the German election too much, but is one of the openings that I see in Germany as well. Even though we will probably have a relatively hawkish, fiscally hawkish party and as part of the government, and even may have this hawkish party have the finance ministry, I think the opening for funding climate change investment, both public and private, I think this is one of the biggest openings for reform of the fiscal framework that we should definitely focus on and we should use. Whether that means, a green golden rule, as some have proposed, whether that means sort of a co-payment to private investment in the green transition and so forth, this is to be debated, I think. But politically, this is the biggest opening I see in this debate. And I think I'll leave it at that because there are many questions in the Q&A, and I'm happy to come in on any of the more nerdy stuff if people are interested. But I think I'll pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thanks for that, Christian. I think you started a little bit talking about the challenges, but I'm glad you ended on a slightly more positive note of there being some political opportunities. I guess maybe I'd like to start the questions by asking what the rest of the panelists think about the politics of this and what opportunities there are in terms of changing the fiscal frameworks. If anyone wants to jump in.
Can I jump in? Thank you. I hope you. So thank you. I think it was a very, very interesting panel. I was taking a lot of notes, and I will further read the PP. But let me start by what I think has maybe been overlooked by some speaker, namely the magnitude of the response and the institutional creativity. I mean, I tell you, I was been working onshore specifically for 6 months before the crisis. If you were to ask me how I see the file in February 2020, and I could not imagine what happened in April 2nd, when the Commission issued a regulation, proposal for regulation, which was adopted by member states. So there has been, I think, a game changer. The EU is now becoming a large bond issuer in Europe. I think we should start, and this has been achieved at unanimity. Just for sure, for instance, you have 19 beneficiaries, but all member states supply on-call, irrevocable guarantee, even if they didn't use the instrument. And I'm not talking about the RF, which I think in a way I've changed the ballpark of what we are talking, and install a kind of contract-based relation between member states and the Commission, which was very fruitful. But I think one key element would be to have the RF well implemented. So RF is in place, but now it has to be implemented on the ground. And I think that the political economy of it, so I like Christian's point, will be absolutely key. Because, I mean, let's be fair. It's not the Commission, it's not the EU who decide about fiscal policy. It's the member states which are sovereign. We can influence them as much we can. Two, there is different view in Europe. I mean, there is a polarization between, let's say, those who are careful of avoiding too much transfer and those who want to avoid austerity. So the political economy of the debate is key. And what I think some intervention by Professor Onaran was very interesting, and all the challenges are, I think, relevant. But should we, I mean, in a way, is it for the EU fiscal rule to solve all that? So sorry to say, but I'm a pragmatist, and I think to leave by the word of Tim Bergen, who's saying one instrument, one objective. And here we have a lot of objective and different instruments. And if I may say so, the quality of public finance is what Professor Onaran was saying, is in the remit of the member states, is their prerogative. So in the RF, you had in the specific context a kind of dialogue of which policy, but it's the member states which, I mean, in a way, retain the prerogative. So it's why the political economy is very important across country and also within a country. On austerity, because we have, I think, let's be fair. I mean, our metrics is actually cyclically adjusted. We could do better, and I agree with Professor Constantini that we use output gap unobserved variable, and this has been a general criticism we can agree upon. But actually, the targets are defined in a kind of cyclical adjusted manner. So in a way, what fiscal policy, I mean, have to try to do is a kind of neutral, let's say, discretionary policy and let the automatic stabilizer play. We didn't do that. Why? Because in good time, it was impossible to enforce a prudent fiscal policy, which depleted actually the buffer for the bad times. And this, I think, it's a very important element. And if we have seen why in the investment contract is because the market fear that fiscal policy was not sustainable and imposing very high spread. So I just want to finish up by just summarizing and saying that in the fiscal framework, there is inbuilt flexibility for to accommodate the fiscal, the business cycle. But it didn't work really much in practice. The political economy is very important. And I want to finish up by a note of optimism. I think what the Europe has managed to achieve in real time from, let's say, February up to now is just remarkable. And you have other institutions, I fully agree with Professor Naran, like EIB, who play a very important role. I mean, I was focusing on the Commission response, sure, and the RF, but there has been the pandemic, let's say, liquidity support. This was very clearly important, but we should be proud as a European and of what has been achieved by unanimity, despite the line of fracture that Christian has eloquently mentioned. Thank you very much, but I want to thank you for excellent debate.
Thank you. Would anyone from the panel like to respond to Mr. Moore's remarks directly?
Yes, please.
Okay, Osola, then Christian.
So I think Monsieur Moore is a bit too modest. I think that the fiscal framework, in fact, has had a huge responsibility in how fiscal policy has been implemented. However, I have to say that on one thing, he's entirely right, that the fiscal framework in itself wouldn't have been so binding if it weren't for the conditionality built into the ECB action in support of public borrowing. And this is, in fact, I could say a sort of integrated system between the fiscal framework and the ECB and the conditionality that has worked well in the sense that it's been effective in implementing austerity, and quite dramatically so in Europe, in the Eurozone at least. In fact, if we talk about political possibilities, I agree that on the one hand, we weren't expecting these new possibilities, such as the Next Generation EU Fund and so on, just merely 1 year or 2 years ago. And that tells us that those who say that it's impossible to reform these frameworks are probably wrong. And one day we'll wake up and something is going to change necessarily. That is my view. In fact, those who have tried to reform the European framework for a long time and have been unsuccessful have been quite frustrated. And some of those have actually started supporting parties that ask for, a disintegration of the European Union. So we need to be careful about that as well. So to maintain a political space where those who have, want to reform the EU can have a voice and can see something actually reflected in the action. The other point that I wanted to make is going back to the idea of conditionality is that when we talk about political influence in the EU and in the Eurozone, some countries have been under the threat and blackmail, essentially, of precisely this combination of fiscal announcements and monetary policy announcements that have put some countries really under a lot of stress financially. And that has limited the democratic space for those countries to present the position of their citizens at the European tables. So as I have argued in the past, I believe that any process first of all, that the EU needs a constitutional moment. And in order to have that, a moment in which, as Monsieur Moore just said, political economy discussion is going to be essential. In order to have that moment, we really need to guarantee some minimal sovereign conditions, as I call them. So we need to guarantee financial support by the ECB on countries' public borrowing, and we need a complete banking union so that there aren't destabilizing mechanisms and dynamics at play that can blackmail and diminish the power, political power of certain positions, ideas, countries.
Thank you. Christian, have you got anything to add to that?
So I just want to come back to the experience of the pandemic and what it has done to the Eurozone, because Giles said, well, the response of the institutions in this crisis was just outstanding. I think this pandemic, if it had anything useful, it was a sort of a test of the Eurozone on two important issues for which there was still some doubt, at least. The first was, ever since Draghi said whatever it takes in 2012, there was a perception that the ECB is the lender of last resort to governments, and that takes away a lot of the threat that we still associate with high debt during the Euro crisis, right? But it was never really tested. Never was there a sort of so severe crisis that it needed to put into practice. And what we've seen in this pandemic, that was the test of the ECB to react and make good on this promise in a way. And we've seen that the ECB, after a slight hiccup at the beginning, actually passed this test. And I think this brought home the message that the ECB, even though it would never say so, is the lender of last resort to Eurozone governments. And the second lingering doubt of the Eurozone was basically, would the North agree to large fiscal transfers to the South in case of a severe external shock? We will never, I think, have that explicitly in our European contracts, or a very explicit insurance mechanism, as it were, because that would require a sort of political union that I cannot imagine at the moment, at least. But the question was, is there an ad hoc fiscal insurance mechanism in place? That was also, after the Euro crisis, a bit in doubt, because what sort of insurance payments were made were, in return for crushing austerity and very tough structural reforms. And you could tell that the ESM, as our default crisis fund, was not even properly used because it was politically so toxic, right? So the fiscal insurance, I think, was in doubt, and the recovery fund, in that sense, served as a very important signal that in severe crisis there is a ad hoc fiscal insurance mechanism in place in Europe. So those are two very important institutional innovations for the Eurozone to make it more stable than it was in the Eurozone crisis. I have more points to make, but I don't want to monopolize this. There are other Q&A questions, so maybe I save them for later.
Thanks, Christian. Just going to ask a question of them, as well as whether you'd like to respond directly to all of this. Another political context, wider than just the EU context, is also the IMF analysis has shown that when including the RRF and automatic stabilizers, the US stimulus is double that of the Eurozone. And IMF regional economic forecasts for Europe have also suggested permanent scarring to the EU output. So do you think the EU should be going further in public investment? And if so, how much further?
Yes, in a way, to be fair, really, Mr. Moore has summarized the context, and we want now more. And this is really what COVID has shown. The European Union has proved capable that it can act as a political union under this pressure, unforeseen pandemic. When we were, hoping that there will be at least some transfers, the whole RRF framework came, and you really managed to go over this divide between the two fronts in the union that you have described. And the other thing from your talk that was very clear in the numbers was it is now possible to coordinate monetary and fiscal policy, whereas monetary policy was doing the all heavy lifting during the Euro crisis. So these are all two positive things. And rightly, our job as researchers is to put these into macroeconometric modeling and say we want more, and it is possible politically to push the frontiers. In my opinion, it is not just about asking too much from fiscal policy. I have mentioned that we have to coordinate fiscal policy with labor market policies. Obviously, it goes without saying, as you said, fiscal policy should be accommodated by monetary policy. And I would add to that also coordination with industrial policy. Now, how much more, maybe coming back to Sarah's point, we have to really look what is the need for ecological investment in the next decade. DG ECOFIN can do that, talking to other DGs. These are institutions of long-term planning in a way. So I'm not going to put a number on that, but for a long time, we have been saying the European Union budget itself has to increase as well. It's true that a lot is left to national fiscal policy, but while we need to coordinate that better, defining priorities in public spending, certainly coordinating taxation to make sure that taxes can be simultaneously increased, say, on wealth. But in my opinion, European Union budget has to be increased to 5% of the European Union GDP. And that has to be accommodated by the ECB with expansionary monetary policy, but certainly it has to be supported by a European Union level progressive taxation. So only then we can live up to the challenges. The good news is you have shown us that this is possible and Europe is capable. I think I'm going to use also the federal word. We need to move towards a more federal political union. Otherwise, we can't cope with the challenges. I think Brexit for me was a very sad wake-up call. And there are always such centrifuge forces. We talk about politics all the time. The politics isn't just the differences of the existing governments, but also citizens' voice does matter in elections. And if we don't address the discontent of the European Union citizens, they find different allies to express that, sometimes not necessarily really addressing the core problem, like in the case of Brexit, but we need to move further, be able to address inequalities, regional, class, gender, race, ecological sustainability, but also the massive social policy, social infrastructure gap. So I think emergency is there, people's voice is there, people want now more from Europe because you proved that you can do it.
And Giles, would you agree that the EU should go further to the extent of matching the US, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, thank you very much. I think it's, I agree, Professor Onaran, that there is a lot of challenge beyond the crisis, which expect us to have a sustainable growth model. But I mean, I don't have the figure in front of me, but clearly, if you look at the first Biden plan and the RF, it seems that actually is true. The response in the US is slightly stronger. But when you use the automatic stabilizer, so we have a lot of safety net in Europe, and actually we had a huge cyclical deficit because of the attrition of the tax base during the crisis, which allow actually to inject liquidity and support demand during and clearly, if you look at that, the response are on par. So I think the Biden plan may evolve and will be bigger, but I make a plea to not look at only the discretionary fiscal policy, the new measure, but also let's say the automatic stabilizer, which are weaker in the US because you don't have social safety net. And if I may, I think in a way extend what Professor Onaran said, because I mean, the challenges are very relevant. The problem is to mapping out where it belongs. I mean, what is the institution who can do it? I think the EU, it will clearly try to support that digital transition. The question of economic aging, of course, the green. I mean, we have the Green Deal, which could make Europe the most ambitious at the frontier continent. So we may have a more green growth than the rest of the planet and play the value of exemplarity. But of course, you have blockage at the level of member states, you have different level of ambition, and the voice of the people in some country are telling you, no, we don't want to finance. So we have to see that we are also in a world where there is populism. Some populism are anti-transfer, some are anti-austerity, and we need to build consensus. So I would say what the president said is, let's try to also have a realistic, as Christian say, try to see the mapping between the economic optimum and also the political economic optimum. So the curve, so we could have something real, and we are not talking about, what the optimal, which will not happen in the coming decade. Is why I like the SURE and Next Generation EU, because it was the, it was the optimum in a way embodied in the institutional reality. But the Commission will have to support it, but it's a collective work, and consensus will be very important. So this is a challenge lying ahead, and I just want to recall that this discussion has been broadened above, I would say, or beyond clearly the simple remit of the fiscal rule. And I just want to make the point that when I talk about the fiscal rule, everybody stuff the whole European sustainable growth agenda, while fiscal rule, in a way, try to foster a balance between debt sustainability, macroeconomic stabilization, and supporting investment. And I tell you, this is not just a piece of cake. And the review may help us understand how we locate ourselves on this trade-off. So I stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on the amount of investment that the EU should be thinking about going forwards? Or I can move on to another question. So given the potential for a range of different coordination mechanisms, and that recognizing that potentially the fiscal rules are not the only player in the game, but given the potential for monetary and fiscal coordination, to what extent, if at all, do we actually need to build and save fiscal space for responding to a shock when we know that central banks can be there to support fiscal policy, and there may well be high demand for safe assets?
Should I start?
Do you want to come in?
So the Eurozone is still not a sort of unified political country. And so I think the nexus between fiscal and monetary policy will never be at the level of the Bank of England with the Treasury, or the Fed with the US Finance Ministry. That being said, this argument is usually overplayed in the other direction, I think. And the argument is made particularly in the context of the German debate that only because we were so fiscally prudent, we could react as boldly as we could. I don't think it would have mattered whether Germany had 60 or 80 or 100% of the debt to GDP ratio in its reaction to the pandemic. So I think we are still in most countries, or we were in this pandemic, most countries safely away from this threshold. But you could tell from the reaction of Italy, for example, that they were pushing the limits of what was perceived as the sustainable sort of nexus between fiscal and monetary policy. So there's no clear figure, I think, where you can pinpoint it and say 90% debt to GDP is sort of the threshold above which it becomes problematic. But I think that what I just described before as the sort of two institutional innovation, the ECB's lender of last resort function and the EU recovery fund as a sort of ad hoc insurance mechanism, together with the SURE program. Sorry, I didn't want to ignore that. I think shows that there was room for higher debt and even being able to address this pandemic. but it's not wise to overplay that argument. I think that and pretend that there's no issue of high public debt in Europe, because it is not a full political union, and there will never be the same sort of nexus between the ECB and European treasuries as there is between the Fed and the US Treasury.
Thanks, Christian. Did anyone else want to come in on this? Rosella?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned the case of Italy, which I think is quite paradigmatic of a situation that's a bit paradoxical. I mean, so we've had public debt to GDP increasing quite dramatically also in the face of severe austerity. So maybe the recipe is not correct. Maybe we are going exactly the wrong direction. Italy has been running primary surpluses, prime budget surpluses since the 90s. And, of course, one can say, well, the public debt to GDP increased because of a shock, a crisis. But as I said in my initial remarks, crisis, fiscal policy is not, it can also prevent or reduce crisis. The fact that we haven't used fiscal policy in that respect is a failure. The fact that we had this high income oscillation and fluctuations has been a fiscal policy failure, and it's due to a reduced public investment, reduced public intervention in the economy. When we say that we have more automatic stabilizers, but Germany, which is a country arguably with the largest fiscal space, no matter how you define fiscal space in Europe, had 3.5% deficit in 2020 only. I mean, it's a ridiculous figure. And that not only because it didn't spend as much as the US, but also because it benefits of a coordination problem, of a spillover effect within the European Union. So it benefits from the spending of the other countries. There's a coordination problem. There's a problem that, even when the fiscal rules are not in place, we are not spending enough. So in terms of, what type of, you asked for a figure in public investment. I think that if we look at the history of the European Union, there has been a problem in coordinating expansions. And that has prevented the creation of virtuous effect of coordinated expansions and demand expansion in different countries. When one country was, for instance, increasing wages, another was implementing austerity and subtracting resources from other countries. And so I believe that, more than just talking about public investment, we need to talk about coordination of this expansion at the European level, because a fiscal rule that applies symmetrically to all countries is just not feasible. One last remark, the ECB is not a lender of last resort. It can act as one, but it's not officially one, and we don't know for how long it's going to be. And that, proves the point. What proves this point is the fact that countries with higher debt to GDP haven't spent as much as the others during this crisis, as the graph that I showed but did not discuss during my initial remarks.
Thanks very much, Rosella. Would anyone else like to comment? Özlem?
I think public debt to GDP will come down by public spending, not by cutting public spending, provided that public spending serves long-term infrastructure needs that will enhance productivity. And the other way to bring public debt to GDP is to mobilize an avenue of taxation that we haven't tapped into sufficiently. That's wealth taxation. And if you target the top 1% of wealth, that surely will not interfere with the supply side potential growth prospects. What we see is taxing the top 1% decreases financialization of non-financial corporations, is conducive to investment. It does decrease monopoly power. if I am to make a Christmas wish for one policy tool, that will be my wish. That creates a lot of fiscal space, not to hoard for the rainy day, but to invest. And I think financial markets are not that limited in their side. They look at what you're doing. They can see the impact of that. I mean, obviously, back to Europe, if these things are coordinated, it's a lot easier to stand against lobbies who will say, oh, a taxation of wealth on the top 1% would kill businesses. No, actually, businesses would be, if such taxation would be used to invest in infrastructure that will improve their business environment.
Thanks, Özlem. I'd maybe like to, Giles, did you want to jump in with one?
No, I think you raised a very good question, Sarah. I want to come back to it. Actually, I think there is some estimate that the investment need, it was your question, for the climate and digital transition, it's something like 610 billion per year over a period of 10 years. And so this will be indeed give a little bit of an idea of the magnitude of the challenge. But on the debt issue, I want to just say that we have reached post-World War II record high level of debt and record low debt servicing due to high energy. So basically the positive differential, which was not so positive on impact during the crisis, since growth collapsed. But we have to remind that we cannot, the armed energy debate cannot be assumed to be a permanent feature of our economy. And an important element on debt, which is overlooked, is I agree with Professor Onaran that if you finance debt with capital stock, then in a way your net debt is not moving, and you give higher productive or healthier, greener production system to the next generation. But we saw also that sometimes, I mean, in a way, there is a temptation to use current spending. And for instance, for the RRF, clearly the Commission has been clear. We should make sure that the RRF finance investment is not upset by a cut in nationally financed investment. This is very important, that there is no substitution, but complementarity. On the policy response, I didn't, maybe I should have hammered it strongly, but I before going to show an RRF, I was mentioning the softening of the regulatory framework. I mean, to Mrs. Constantini, I mean, what we did immediately, just before sure, I think it was in the middle of February, we suspend the normal operation of the Stability and Growth Pact. It's called the General Escape Clause, to avoid that the pact could be in the way of the exceptional, unprecedented emergency response that member states were going into. I mean, so the pact has a General Escape Clause, which was used to meet the challenge. So let's not have and if I may, the implementation of the rule we have seen since 2015 has been considered by some to be too flexible. I just want to I'm not taking a statement on that, but I'm just reporting. And lastly, I think it's important that, I will not paraphrase Kennedy, but member states on the challenge have a role to play. And for instance, the importance of having greener national budgeting may help. The Commission is also discussing that with member states more at technical level. It's a matter of, it's a national prerogative, but a good national fiscal framework could help. And we see complementarity, the functioning of EU rules. So I just want to stress the need for complementarity. That is a collective game we need to play. And collective gain means consensus. I stop it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Giles. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and it's a shame, but I think we have to wrap it up now. But I'd like to end by asking everyone, Özlem already gave us one, but we'll ask everybody else. What would be your Christmas wish for fiscal policy reform? And Özlem, I think we'll let you have two. So, Christian, would you like to start?
Well, I mean, my Christmas wishes are not very bold in that sense, but I think that both the national fiscal frameworks and the European one, if we find a consensus that those need to be made climate proof, that they need to be fit for the Paris targets, that would be my most important wish for Christmas. And what that means in practice, of course, that would be a very long wish list that I don't think Santa Claus can carry.
Thanks, Christian, for keeping that short and sweet. Özlem, do you have a second Christmas wish? Or do you need to give me, do I need to give you more?
Oh, no, I have actually a second. Thank you. This is very privileged, but I think I would like to see the European fiscal policy framework acknowledge that what we call current spending in nurses, social care workers, nursery teachers, educators, is social infrastructure investment, and therefore also consider that as part of your New Deal. So I would like to see not just a green, but a purple-green New Deal, with, of course, sufficient taxes to support such an investment, hence my second wish, wealth taxation. Thank you so much for giving me two.
Thanks. Giles, what's your Christmas wish?
Let me cheat a bit because I'm living in Belgium and we have two Santa. We have Santa Claus and we have Father Christmas. Father Christmas on Christmas and Santa Claus, I think 6th of December. I have young kids, so I know. So I will have two wishes, one for Santa, one for Father Christmas. For Santa, a modest one. I would like that people could read, at least read, the review the Commission has put the 5th of February 2020, because I think you may disagree with it, but it will be a good base because we try to have a backward-looking review to the point with fact, and important that you could disagree with fact, but important to have to nourish a very good debate. So this may help. Or to the Father Christmas, I will be more ambitious. And I will ask him, exactly like Christian, a consensus among the key player on a landing zone which indeed meet up or live up to the big challenge Professor Onaran recall, and which are not challenge for this decade, a challenge for this century. So it's actually a wish for not only my children, which are young, but also my grandchildren, if any. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. And then Osola, last but definitely not least.
Thank you. I think I will join Özlem in her wish for an effort to improve infrastructures, especially those related to care, education, and adapting to climate change. I also, however, if I may have one specific for myself, think that it would be, it's crucial for the survival of the European Union that we establish some intergovernmental coordination and possibly some federal fiscal framework that really is federal.
Thank you. I mean, thank you to all of our really brilliant panelists and speakers. I think this has been a really great discussion. And I'd also like to point out to anyone here who might be interested that this is part of a week of events put on by Fiscal Matters, which you can, I think someone will be posting the website in the chat. So there'll be lots more events that you can attend and discuss over the next week. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.